I'm Teresa Coraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. My topic today is Kennedy straddles the divide, in the process making himself both unelectable and ineffectual. I'm going to give 3 examples of where I think he's doing that, and then talk about why I think if he would focus on being effectual, he could end up accomplishing both. And then I did a recent interview with Mark Kulak on Housatonic Live, and I want to talk about some highlights of that because it was so fun and so informative. We talked about 9/11, economics, the decline in home ownership, and all the different things that are going into this situation with Malone. So that's something that if I can, I'll post it on YouTube because he does not, but I will definitely have links to Rumble and BitChute and Odyssey on my Substack version of this program. To start with Kennedy, and the most obvious way in which he is straddling the divide is by him saying, I am not an anti-vaxxer. He has written the book, The Real Anthony Fauci, which gives more evidence of why the vaccine program has been completely and unethically abused in third world countries, in poorer populations in the US, and also for a depopulation agenda, as the results show, whether or not there's an ability to show intent. So he has all the data on that with Children's Health Defense, but at the same time, he's not bringing any of that to bear in his public conversations. So this seems to be, I'm guessing, a way of saying, oh, I'm with you who are for vaccines, but here's why this particular one was not effective or safe. And that is not going to use the momentum that we've gained over the last 3 years. If there's any good that's come out of this, it's been exposing the dangers of the vaccine program in general and showing the use of the healthcare system and particularly government agencies in order to enact their own either for-profit agenda or, even worse, depopulation agenda with whoever they're answering to. Another place that Bobby is straddling the divide is on Robert Malone. In one case, Malone posts that it seems like Bobby is distancing himself from him. And then in a Virginia paper, the reporter asked Robert Kennedy, what do you admire most about Robert Malone? And puts Malone in the title. So that question seems like a very obvious setup that did corner Kennedy. But what he said was, I think it is really hard to be Robert Malone. It takes a lot of courage because you're being attacked from all sides. And so what he responded with was something very placating, something that, again, tried to go middle of the road and did not really satisfy either side. If that was meant to placate Malone, I don't think it worked. Or rather, maybe it worked the way that Malone intended, which is that it caused many of us to question Bobby Kennedy and his judgment. But at the same time, I believe that Malone has made a hard pivot towards Trump. He's always been entertaining 3 different ways in which he could end up in a high-level position in the health industry, the Department of Defense/health industry. And that has been through Kennedy, through Trump, and through DeSantis, whose name he couldn't even remember right away when he was talking to Hatfill. So with Trump, I think this is in evidence because of not just a change in substance, but also style. He stopped being the genteel gentleman farmer and now is more crude, is more blunt, is much more Trump-like, and I believe is actually coming back into who he really has been all along. He uses terms about the vaccination program saying, oh yeah, they screwed the pooch on that one. And you're talking about using excavators to bury the bodies that are stacking up if we have a 40% mortality pandemic, something that both Mark and I found appalling. So all of the sudden, the gloves have come off, and I think the mask has come off. And there is this change. So that's how I think he's actually throwing Kennedy under the bus. And that brings up the third area where Kennedy is straddling the divide, which is on Israel. So in the conversation with Hatfield and Malone, which is highly scripted, as Mark and I talk about, there is a scene that seems out of the blue where Malone brings up a story about John Luttrell, I think it is, who gets some heat about talking about ethnically targeted viruses. And he has heard this from Malone, so he asked Malone to give him some sources so that he can back it up. And Malone says, I am a little bit offended, John. After all, I am the goddamn expert. But here's this and this and this and this and this and this. As we all know by now, Kennedy has come under attack because of a comment that he made, which he thought was off the record, about the virus not having the same impact on Ashkenazi Jews. This is something that he could well have learned from Malone. As Malone says, it's not controversial. I will cite in my Substack a 1998 article in Wired magazine talking about Israel's secret bioweapon that is ethnically targeted and how they're doing that because they believe that Iraq already has one. So this is something that's been out there, but was Kennedy set up in a way so that he would be repeating that information and where it would be leaked? That seems to me entirely possible. Instead of citing sources and validating his remarks with statistical proof, Kennedy has overcompensated by saying no one has ever been as strong of a supporter of Israel as I am. So this is something that Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal have talked about as really disappointing. Both of them, I believe, are Jewish, and both of them have been some of the most outspoken people for the Palestinian cause and against what Israel is doing politically. So that is something that I think has caused, again, both sides to say, well, I can't say that I'm for this person. This person is not taking a moral stance. What Aaron and Max are saying is at least he's expanding the conversation. He is speaking out against more support for Ukraine, saying that we can't afford it. And Glenn Greenwald is questioning him about Israel and saying, well, if we can't afford to support Ukraine because of all the problems in the U.S., isn't that the same thing for Israel, who gets more support than any other country in terms of foreign aid? Although now with Ukraine, I'm not sure that's true. The question of Israel, of course, is much bigger than Palestine, as if that was not already enough. But I mentioned to Mark that I've been reading One Nation Under Blackmail by Whitney Webb, and that it is giving an answer to that question that I keep talking about, which is, who do these organizations answer to? We know that the CIA doesn't answer to the president. That was made evident by JFK's assassination. And in this book, even though it is about Jeffrey Epstein, really what it's about are the CIA and Israeli intelligence and how the two of them are intertwined. And so for the ultimate question of who does all this funnel towards, I think we need to be looking at this line of royalty. And the reason that I say it that way is because if we're talking about British royalty and what they are doing, or what the City of London is doing, no one confuses that with being anti-British. It isn't against the English people. And when we talk about the things that are being done by the presidents and the leaders, so-called, in other countries, we're not confusing that with the people. But in the case of the Semites, and I don't use the term Judaism or Jews because I think that there were two different forms of that. One was anti-imperial, and we've lost that to history. So what I look at is the Semites, and the Semites are the sons of Shem, who was the son of Noah, who was given dominion over all the land and all the people, and the Canaanites were given to all their descendants to be their slaves in perpetuity. So a belief in a God that does that sort of thing and gives some ownership over the land and the people is something I think we should all reject. So I am anti-Semitism as that belief system, and you should be too. To tie these two together, Mark and I talked a lot about anthrax and the anthrax attacks that were immediately after 9/11. I mentioned that 9/11 for me had been my wake-up call. That was when I started questioning things and looking at the "they hate us because we love freedom" as utter nonsense, and having that disconnect with other people who weren't reacting to that. So after the call, Mark and I continued to talk, and we talked about his theory that the anthrax attacks were actually what they were preparing for, that they had done 20 different exercises leading up to what was supposed to happen on 9/11, which was a massive drop of anthrax and smallpox. And that was what everything was leading up towards, so that there could be this takeover by FEMA and all of the health organizations. But his theory is that Israel interfered with that by instead planning the attack on the World Trade Centers, and that was something that pivoted it instead to being a geopolitical military crisis rather than health. I think this is one of the most interesting theories I've heard in a long time, and I am certainly not doing it justice, but he has a lot of research that is on his site at Housatonics Live and looks at both COVID and 9/11 and anthrax. This theory of Mark's has ominous correspondence to the ones of Isaac Middle, who does Down the Wombat Hole. And what Isaac has been looking at are the Shemitahs, the every 7 years that something cataclysmic keeps happening right around September, October. And he is looking at this being the year of Jubilee, rather than that being a lovely, nice little thing where everyone's debts are forgiven. If we look at the story of Shem in the Old Testament, in Genesis, and how The debt is really forgiving it by giving back the land, which belongs to the Shemites according to God. That makes it have a completely different twist to it. And so I think that we should be wondering whether there is something that things are building up to coming to a theater near you this fall. To conclude, if these things are correct, we may be in a different world by November, and Kennedy would be better off being someone who was not going along with the plan. Thank you, Mark, for such a fun and lively discussion. And even though you apologized for the fact that it was my interview, I would always prefer a great conversation. To follow this up, here is What a Smoke and Wombat Holes, and then also The Devil and Naomi Wolf. Thank you for watching.